3 months after that historic September evening, James Mitchell found himself standing in the same corridor where he had witnessed the end of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. The palace had returned to its normal rhythms, but everything felt fundamentally different. The portrait that had hung outside the Queen's apartments for decades had been replaced with one of King Charles III, and the subtle changes throughout the building reflected the new era that had begun on that unforgettable night. James had been promoted to senior guard following his exemplary service during the Queen's final hours, a recognition that filled him with pride, but also reminded him daily of the profound responsibility he had carried during those historic moments. Captain Morrison had recommended the promotion personally, citing James's professionalism and composure during what he called the most significant duty assignment any guard could ever receive. The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II had taken place 3 weeks after her death, and James had been selected as one of the guards who lined the processional route from Westminster Abbey to Windsor Castle. Standing at attention as the Queen's coffin passed by, carried on the gun carriage pulled by the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery, James had felt the full weight of history. The ceremony had been watched by an estimated 4 billion people around the world, making it one of the most viewed events in television history. During the funeral, James had observed the remarkable dignity displayed by King Charles III and the entire royal family as they said their final goodbye to the Queen. The new monarch had maintained perfect composure throughout the ceremony, even as millions watched him deal with his grief on the most public stage imaginable. The sight of the King's obvious emotion as the Queen's coffin was lowered into the royal vault at Windsor Castle had moved even the most hardened observers. The period of official mourning had lasted for 10 days, during which James had performed ceremonial duties at various events commemorating the Queen's life and reign. He had stood guard during the lying-in state at Westminster Hall, where hundreds of thousands of people had queued for hours to pay their final respects to their beloved monarch. The patience and respect shown by ordinary citizens from all walks of life had reinforced James's understanding of the genuine affection that people had felt for Queen Elizabeth II. James often thought about the personal conversation he had been granted with King Charles III just 2 days after the Queen's death. The new monarch had requested to meet privately with the guard who had been present during his mother's final hours, and James had been nervous about the prospect of speaking directly with the king about such a personal and painful subject. The conversation had taken place in the same sitting room where the royal family had gathered during the Queen's final vigil. King Charles III had thanked James personally for his service and had asked him to share his observations about the Queen's final hours. James had spoken carefully about the dignity and peace that had characterized those moments, and he could see that his words brought some comfort to the grieving son. "My mother would have been pleased to know that you were there," the king had said quietly. "She always appreciated the dedication of the guards, and she would have felt honored to have someone like you standing watch during her final hours." James had been deeply moved by the king's words, but what affected him most was the genuine humanity that Charles had displayed during their conversation. Despite the enormous pressures of his new role and his personal grief, the king had taken time to acknowledge the service of a young guard from Yorkshire who had simply been doing his duty. The conversation had lasted nearly 30 minutes, during which the king had asked James about his background, his family, and his plans for the future. When James mentioned that his parents had traveled from Yorkshire to attend the Queen's funeral, the king had expressed genuine interest in meeting them, leading to a brief but meaningful encounter that James's parents would treasure for the rest of their lives. "Your son served the crown with distinction during a very difficult time," the king had told James's parents. "You should be proud of him, as I am grateful to him." The impact of those words on James's parents had been profound. His father, who had worked in the coal mines for 40 years, had tears in his eyes as he shook hands with the king. His mother, who had cleaned houses to help support their family, had curtsied with remarkable grace before telling the king that serving the crown had always been an honor for their son. In the weeks following the funeral, James had received numerous letters from people around the world who had somehow learned of his role during the Queen's final hours. Citizens from Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth countries had written to thank him for his service and to share their own memories of the Queen. Reading these letters had helped James understand the global impact of the Queen's death and the genuine affection that people around the world had felt for her. One letter that particularly moved James came from an elderly woman in Canada who had met the Queen during a royal visit to Toronto in 1984. She wrote about how the Queen had taken time to speak with her young daughter, who was in a wheelchair, and had made the little girl feel special and important. "Knowing that someone like you was there with her at the end gives me comfort," the woman had written. "It means she wasn't alone, and that matters more than you might realize." James had also received an unexpected invitation to speak at his old school in Yorkshire about his experiences as a Queen's Guard. Standing before the same assembly hall where he had attended morning prayers as a student, James had tried to convey to the next generation the importance of service and duty. He had spoken about the honor of serving something larger than oneself, and about the unexpected ways that ordinary people could find themselves at the center of historic events. "I never expected to witness history," James had told the students. "I thought I would stand guard outside the palace gates, do my duty, and return home to Yorkshire after my service ended. But sometimes life puts you exactly where you need to be, even when you don't realize it at the time." The students had listened with remarkable attention as James described the responsibility and privilege of serving the crown. Several had approached him afterward to ask about joining the military, and James had been pleased to share information about the various opportunities available to young people who wanted to serve their country. James had also maintained contact with Margaret, the Queen's former personal secretary, who had struggled with the adjustment to life after decades of royal service. Margaret had found comfort in sharing memories of the Queen with someone who had been present during those final hours, and their conversations had helped both of them process the significance of what they had witnessed. "She died as she lived," Margaret had told James during one of their meetings, "with dignity, surrounded by love, and in service to others until the very end. Even in her final hours, she was concerned about making sure everyone else was all right." The relationship between James and Margaret had evolved into a genuine friendship based on their shared experience of serving the crown during a historic moment. Margaret had introduced James to other long-serving members of the royal household, and he had gained a deeper appreciation for the dedication and professionalism of the people who made royal life possible. As winter gave way to spring, James began to think about his own future beyond his military service. The experience of witnessing the Queen's death had given him a perspective on life that he hadn't possessed before, and he felt a calling to find ways to serve others in civilian life. He had begun exploring opportunities in education and public service, inspired by the Queen's example of dedicating one's life to something larger than personal ambition. The King had established a scholarship program in his mother's memory, designed to help young people from working-class backgrounds pursue higher education. When James learned about the program, he had immediately thought of students at his old school in Yorkshire who might benefit from such opportunities. He had volunteered to help identify potential candidates and to serve as a mentor for scholarship recipients. James often returned to the corridor outside what had been the Queen's private apartments, which now served as a private study for King Charles III. Standing in that familiar space, he could remember every detail of that historic September evening. The sounds, the faces, the emotions, and the profound sense of being present for a moment that would be remembered forever. The experience had changed James in ways he was still discovering. He approached his duties with even greater seriousness and dedication than before, understanding that service to the crown was not just about standing at attention or following orders. It was about being part of an institution that connected the present to the past and would extend into the future long after any individual's service had ended. Looking toward the future, James felt optimistic about the new reign of King Charles III. He had observed the new monarch's dedication to his duties and his genuine care for the people he served. The transition from Queen Elizabeth II to King Charles III had been handled with remarkable grace and dignity, reflecting the strength of the constitutional system that the Queen had served so faithfully throughout her long reign. As he prepared to complete his service as a Queen's Guard in the coming year, James knew that the experience of those historic hours in September would remain with him forever. He had been granted the extraordinary privilege of witnessing the end of one era and the beginning of another, and he understood that this experience would shape the rest of his life. The young man from Yorkshire who had joined the military to serve his country had found himself at the center of one of the most significant moments in modern British history. He had performed his duty with honor during the Queen's final hours, and he would carry that service with him as he moved forward into whatever challenges and opportunities awaited him in the years ahead. Standing in that quiet corridor, James reflected on the final lesson that Queen Elizabeth II had taught him through her death, that dignity, duty, and service to others were values that transcended any individual life. The Queen was gone, but the principles she had embodied would continue to inspire new generations of people who sought to serve something larger than themselves. James was determined to be one of those people, carrying forward the legacy of service that he had been privileged to witness during those unforgettable hours when silence fell over Buckingham Palace, and history turned a page that would never be turned back. At precisely 8:30 p.m., the silence that had enveloped Buckingham Palace was broken by the sound of footsteps hurrying toward the communications office. James watched as senior palace officials moved with practiced efficiency to coordinate the announcement that would inform the world of Queen Elizabeth II's death. The carefully orchestrated plan that had been prepared for decades was now being implemented with remarkable precision and dignity. The first public indication came as a simple black-bordered notice was posted on the gates of Buckingham Palace. The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow. The understated elegance of these few words somehow captured the profound significance of the moment while maintaining the dignity that had characterized the Queen's entire reign. James remained at his post as palace staff worked to manage the immediate aftermath of the announcement. Within minutes, crowds began gathering outside the palace gates, drawn by the news that was spreading rapidly through social media and news broadcasts. The spontaneous outpouring of public grief was immediate and overwhelming, as people felt the need to come to Buckingham Palace to pay their respects and share their sorrow with others who were experiencing the same sense of loss. The new King Charles III had to balance his personal grief with the immediate responsibilities of his new role. James observed as the king met with senior palace officials to discuss the arrangements that would need to be made for the coming days. The funeral would be a state occasion that would bring together world leaders and millions of ordinary citizens, and every detail would need to be planned and coordinated with military precision. Television broadcasters around the world interrupted their regular programming to share the news of the Queen's death, and James could imagine the moment of shock that millions of people must be experiencing as they learned that the woman who had been a constant presence in their lives for 7 decades was gone. News anchors who had prepared for this moment for years still seemed stunned by the reality of having to announce the end of the Elizabethan age. Margaret, the Queen's personal secretary, faced the enormous task of managing the correspondence and official communications that would flood into the palace in the coming days. World leaders would send condolences, ordinary citizens would mail letters of sympathy, and organizations around the Commonwealth would request guidance on appropriate protocols for marking the Queen's passing. The administrative burden of death, even for a monarch, was staggering in its complexity. James thought about the personal items in the Queen's private apartments that would now need to be carefully cataloged and preserved. Her personal correspondence, her photographs, her books, and the countless mementos from 7 decades of public service would become historical artifacts that would help future generations understand the woman behind the crown. The process of sorting through a lifetime of accumulated memories would be both emotionally difficult and historically significant for those entrusted with the task. The Archbishop of Canterbury returned to the palace to meet with the new king about the funeral arrangements that would take place in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony would need to balance the religious significance of the occasion with the constitutional requirements of a state funeral, and every element would be scrutinized by billions of people around the world who would watch the proceedings live on television and online. Prince William, now heir to the throne as well as a grieving grandson, faced his own period of adjustment as the line of succession shifted with his grandmother's death. James watched as the prince consulted with advisors about the new responsibilities he would inherit and the role he would play in supporting his father during the challenging transition period. The weight of future kingship was now resting on shoulders that had been prepared for this burden since childhood. The spontaneous memorial that began forming outside the palace gates grew larger by the hour, as people brought flowers, photographs, and personal tributes to the woman who had been their queen for their entire lives. James could see the crowds gathering through the palace windows, and he was struck by the genuine emotion displayed by ordinary citizens who felt compelled to express their grief in a public way. Palace security worked to manage the increasing crowds while maintaining the dignity appropriate to the occasion. The outpouring of public sentiment was welcomed and expected, but it also created logistical challenges that needed to be addressed carefully. The balance between allowing people to grieve publicly and maintaining order and security required constant attention and adjustment as the evening progressed. Dr. Harrison completed the final medical documentation required by law and prepared to leave the palace after nearly 15 hours of attendance. The elderly physician had served the royal family faithfully for years, and his professional relationship with the Queen had evolved into genuine personal affection and respect. His final service to the monarch he had cared for so long was ensuring that all legal and medical requirements were met with appropriate thoroughness and dignity. James observed the remarkable composure of the palace staff as they managed the complex transition from serving Queen Elizabeth II to serving King Charles III. The institutional memory and professional expertise of these men and women would be crucial in maintaining continuity during the challenging weeks ahead. Their ability to balance personal grief with professional duty reflected the same qualities that had made the Queen herself such a respected and beloved figure. The Queen's beloved corgis, who had been her constant companions for decades, were now facing their own adjustment to life without their beloved mistress. Palace staff arranged for the dogs to be cared for by family members, ensuring that these living symbols of the Queen's personal life would continue to receive the love and attention they had known throughout their lives. Even in death, the Queen's concern for all living creatures under her care was being honored and respected. News organizations around the world began broadcasting retrospective programs about the Queen's life and reign, sharing footage from 7 decades of public service and personal milestones. James realized that for the rest of his life, he would occasionally see images from this very day included in those historical documentaries, and he might even glimpse himself standing guard during one of the most significant moments in modern British history. The complexity of managing the constitutional implications of the Queen's death became apparent as legal experts arrived at the palace to ensure that all protocols were followed correctly. The transfer of royal authority from one monarch to another involved numerous legal requirements that had to be completed within specific timeframes, and the margin for error was essentially zero, given the global attention focused on these proceedings. King Charles III spent time reviewing the funeral arrangements that had been planned in detail for many years, but now needed to be finalized and implemented. The ceremony would be the largest gathering of world leaders in recent memory, and the security and logistical challenges were enormous. Every head of state would need to be accommodated with appropriate protocol, and the entire event would be broadcast live to an audience of billions around the world. James thought about the historical significance of what he had witnessed during his 12-hour shift. Future historians would write about this day as a turning point in British history, marking the end of the longest reign ever recorded and the beginning of a new era under King Charles III. The young guard from Yorkshire had been present for a moment that would be studied and remembered for centuries to come. The immediate family began making plans for their return to London, where they would face the full weight of public attention and ceremonial responsibilities that would accompany the coming funeral arrangements. Their private grief would have to be managed alongside their public duties, and the next few weeks would test their ability to balance personal loss with constitutional obligations. Margaret worked late into the evening, coordinating with government officials, Commonwealth representatives, and international dignitaries who needed to be informed officially of the Queen's death and the accession of King Charles III. The diplomatic implications of the transition were significant, and every communication needed to be carefully crafted to maintain the relationships that the Queen had built and nurtured throughout her reign. The palace staff prepared for the arrival of additional security personnel and administrative support that would be needed to manage the increased activity in the coming days. The normal rhythms of palace life would be disrupted for weeks as the focus shifted entirely to funeral preparations and the early days of the new king's reign. Everyone would need to adapt quickly to new routines and responsibilities while maintaining the high standards expected of royal service. James felt privileged to have witnessed the dignity and grace with which the royal family had faced this most difficult of days. Despite their global prominence and constitutional significance, they had displayed the same human emotions and needs for comfort that any family would experience during such a loss. Their ability to maintain composure while dealing with genuine grief was a testament to the values and training that had shaped their entire lives. As the evening deepened, James realized that his role as a witness to history was far from over. The coming days would bring ceremonies and traditions that hadn't been seen for 70 years, and the entire world would be watching as Britain said farewell to Queen Elizabeth II and welcomed King Charles III. The young guard who had started his shift expecting a routine day had instead become part of one of the most significant events in modern history. The palace began to settle into a different rhythm as staff prepared for the intense period of activity that would follow. The Queen's death had ended one chapter of British history, but it had also begun another, and everyone involved understood the enormous responsibility of ensuring that the transition proceeded with the dignity and respect that both the late Queen and the new King deserved. At exactly 6:30 in the evening, a profound stillness settled over the Queen's private apartments. James had been standing guard for over 12 hours, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment when Dr. Harrison emerged from the Queen's bedroom, his face etched with the gravity of loss. The elderly physician walked slowly to where the Archbishop stood waiting, and James watched as they exchanged a few quiet words that would change the world forever. Queen Elizabeth II, the woman who had reigned over Britain and the Commonwealth for 70 years, had died peacefully, surrounded by her family. The news would not be announced to the public for another hour. But in that quiet corridor of Buckingham Palace, history had just turned a page that would never be turned back. James felt the weight of the moment settling over him like a heavy cloak. He had witnessed the end of an era, standing at attention while the longest-serving monarch in British history drew her final breath. The young man from Yorkshire who had joined the military to serve his country had become an unexpected witness to one of the most significant events in modern history. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, though he would not be formally proclaimed until the following day, emerged from his mother's bedroom with tears streaming down his face. The new monarch made no attempt to hide his grief as he embraced his sister, Princess, and then his brothers, Prince Andrew and Prince Edward. The formal protocols of royal behavior seemed suspended in this moment of profound personal loss. James observed the raw humanity of the scene before him. These were not just figures from news broadcasts or ceremonial occasions. They were children who had lost their mother, grandchildren who would never again receive wisdom from their beloved grandmother. The crown might be eternal, but the people who wore it were as vulnerable to loss and grief as anyone else. Margaret, the Queen's personal secretary, appeared in the doorway of the apartments with the official documents that would need to be signed and transmitted to governments around the Commonwealth. Her face was pale, and her hands shook slightly as she carried the papers that would formally begin the process of transition from one monarch to another. She had served the Queen faithfully for over 2 decades, and now she faced the end of that service with obvious difficulty. Dr. Harrison began the official process of certifying the Queen's death, a responsibility that required precise documentation and careful attention to legal requirements. James watched as the physician completed his solemn duties, knowing that these documents would become part of the historical record of this momentous day. The cause of death would later be listed simply as old age, a peaceful end to a life that had been lived in service to others. The Archbishop of Canterbury gathered the family members together in the Queen's sitting room for a brief prayer of thanksgiving for her life and service. James could hear the soft murmur of voices as they shared memories and offered comfort to one another. The Archbishop's presence brought a sense of spiritual peace to the proceedings, reminding everyone that death was not just an ending but also a transition to whatever lay beyond. Palace staff began to appear in the corridor, moving quietly and efficiently as they initiated the carefully planned procedures that had been rehearsed for years but never implemented. The Queen's death would trigger a complex series of constitutional, legal, and ceremonial processes that would unfold over the coming days and weeks. Every detail had been anticipated and prepared for, but the emotional reality of implementing these plans was something entirely different. James thought about his own family back in Yorkshire, who had no idea that their queen had just died. In a few hours, they would be watching television or listening to the radio when the announcement was made, and they would join millions of others in mourning the loss of a monarch who had been a constant presence throughout their lives. His parents had been born during the Queen's reign, married during her reign, and raised their children during her reign. For them, as for so many others, Queen Elizabeth II had been the only monarch they had ever known. Captain Morrison arrived at the palace to relieve James of his duties, but James requested permission to remain at his post until the official announcement was made. The captain understood the significance of the moment and agreed that James should see the evening through to its conclusion. There was something fitting about the guard who had witnessed the Queen's final hours maintaining his vigil until the world learned of her passing. The new King Charles III spent time with each of his family members, offering comfort and receiving it in return. James could see that the weight of kingship had already settled upon the man's shoulders, even as he dealt with his personal grief. The transition from Prince of Wales to monarch had happened instantly upon his mother's death, and the responsibilities of the crown would now shape every aspect of his life. Palace communications staff gathered in a nearby office to finalize the announcement that would soon be released to the world. James could see the intense concentration on their faces as they prepared for one of the most significant press releases in British history. The words they chose would be the first official confirmation of the Queen's death, and they carried the responsibility of communicating this news with appropriate dignity and respect. Princess, and known throughout her life for her strength and composure, struggled visibly with her emotions as she said goodbye to her mother. James watched as she spent several minutes alone in the Queen's bedroom, having a final private moment with the woman who had shaped her life and her understanding of duty and service. When she emerged, her eyes were red with tears, but her bearing remained regal and dignified. The Queen's personal priest arrived to conduct the final blessing, completing the spiritual observances that would mark the monarch's passing. James observed the peaceful solemnity of these final rituals, understanding that they represented both an ending and a beginning. The Queen's earthly reign had concluded, but her legacy and the institution she had served so faithfully would continue. Dr. Harrison completed his official duties and gathered his medical equipment, his long service to the royal family coming to an end with this final, most solemn responsibility. The elderly physician had cared for the Queen through numerous health challenges over the years, and tonight he had helped ensure that her death was as peaceful and dignified as her life had been. James could see the profound sadness in the doctor's eyes as he prepared to leave the palace for the final time in his professional capacity. Members of the Queen's household staff were quietly informed of her death, and James watched as the news spread through the palace community. These men and women had served the Queen faithfully for years, and their grief was immediate and genuine. The Queen had not just been their employer. She had been someone they respected deeply and, in many cases, had come to love as a person rather than just as a monarch. The clock in the corridor chimed 7:30, and James realized that the official announcement would be made soon. Television and radio stations around the world were standing by, ready to interrupt their regular programming with the news that would mark the end of the Elizabethan age. Social media platforms were prepared for the surge of traffic that would follow the announcement, and news organizations had updated obituaries and tributes ready to publish within minutes of the official confirmation. King Charles III returned to his mother's bedroom for a final private goodbye, spending several minutes alone with the woman who had prepared him throughout his life for this moment. When he emerged, his expression showed the complex mix of grief and acceptance that comes with a loss that has been long anticipated but is no less painful when it finally arrives. The new monarch would now carry forward the legacy and traditions that his mother had maintained so faithfully. James thought about the incredible changes that the Queen had witnessed during her 70-year reign. She had seen the transformation of Britain from a war-torn nation rebuilding after World War II to a modern, diverse society that bore little resemblance to the country she had inherited in 1952. She had guided the monarchy through periods of celebration and scandal, adapting ancient traditions to modern circumstances while maintaining the dignity and stability that people expected from the crown. The Archbishop of Canterbury prepared to leave the palace, his spiritual duties completed, but his role in the coming ceremonies just beginning. In the days ahead, he would preside over the funeral service that would mark the formal farewell to Queen Elizabeth II, bringing together world leaders and ordinary citizens in a final tribute to her life and service. Tonight, however, his presence had provided comfort to a grieving family during their darkest hour. Margaret gathered the official papers that would need to be transmitted to Commonwealth governments, informing them officially of the Queen's death and the accession of King Charles III. These communications would trigger constitutional processes in countries around the world, as new oaths of allegiance were sworn and official portraits were changed to reflect the new monarch. The Commonwealth that the Queen had cherished and nurtured throughout her reign would now transfer its loyalty to her son. James maintained his position as palace staff prepared for the public announcement that would come at 8:30 in the evening. The careful choreography of these final preparations reflected the meticulous planning that had gone into every aspect of the Queen's death and its aftermath. Nothing had been left to chance, and every detail had been considered to ensure that the transition from one reign to another would proceed smoothly and with appropriate dignity. The new king spent a few final moments with his immediate family, sharing grief and comfort as they prepared to face the world as the new royal family. The dynamics of their relationships had changed forever with the Queen's death. They were no longer just children and grandchildren, but the core of the modern monarchy that would carry Britain into the future. Their personal loss would have to be balanced against their public responsibilities in the challenging days and weeks ahead. As the clock approached 8:30, James could feel the anticipation building throughout the palace. In a few minutes, the carefully guarded secret of the Queen's death would be shared with the world, and the period of private grief would give way to public mourning. The announcement would mark not just the end of a life, but the end of an era, as the longest reign in British history officially came to a close. James straightened his shoulders one final time as a Queen's Guard, knowing that when the announcement was made, he would become a witness to history who had served faithfully during the final hours of the Elizabethan age. The young man from Yorkshire had been granted the extraordinary privilege of standing guard during one of the most significant nights in modern British history, and he would carry that honor with him for the rest of his life. The clock in the corridor chimed 9 times, its deep, resonant tones echoing through the suddenly quiet palace halls. James had been at his post for nearly 11 hours, but his military training kept him alert and focused despite the emotional weight of the day. The usual evening activities of the palace had ceased entirely, replaced by an almost sacred silence that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what was unfolding behind the closed doors of the Queen's private apartments. Prince Charles emerged from the Queen's rooms, his face showing the exhaustion of a son watching his mother's final hours. He walked slowly down the corridor, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and paused briefly near a window that overlooked the palace gardens. James could see the prince's shoulders shake slightly, and he realized that even the heir to the throne was struggling with the emotions of this moment. The prince composed himself after a few moments and returned to the Queen's apartments, but not before making eye contact with James. There was something in that brief exchange that struck James deeply. The prince's nod was not the formal acknowledgement that James usually received from royal family members. It was the recognition of one human being to another during an extraordinarily difficult time. Margaret, the Queen's personal secretary, had been in and out of the apartments several times throughout the evening. Each time she appeared, James could see that she had been crying. Margaret had worked for the Queen for over 20 years, and Her obvious grief spoke to the personal relationships that existed behind the formal protocols of palace life. The queen wasn't just a monarch to those who worked closest to her. She was also an employer, a mentor, and, in many ways, a mother figure. Around 9:30, James noticed increased activity from the palace communications staff. Several people carrying official-looking documents hurried through the corridor, their expressions serious and focused. James suspected they were preparing the formal announcements that would soon be necessary, drafting the words that would inform the world of the Queen's death. The Archbishop of Canterbury had remained in the Queen's apartments for several hours, and, when he finally emerged, his presence seemed to bring a sense of peaceful solemnity to the corridor. James had always found something comforting about religious leaders during difficult times, and tonight was no exception. The Archbishop's calm demeanor provided a steadying influence amid the emotional turmoil that surrounded the Queen's final hours. Dr. Harrison made one final check of his medical equipment before entering the Queen's rooms again. James had observed the elderly physician throughout the day, and he could see the toll that these hours had taken on the doctor as well. Dr. Harrison had been the Queen's personal physician for over 15 years, caring for her through various health challenges as she aged. Tonight, he was not just providing medical care. He was helping to ensure that the Queen's final moments were as comfortable and dignified as possible. The family members had settled into what appeared to be a final vigil. Prince William and Prince Harry had put aside any personal differences they might have had, standing together as they faced the loss of their beloved grandmother. Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, showed rare emotion as she moved between her mother's bedside and brief conversations with her brothers in the sitting area adjacent to the Queen's bedroom. James thought about his own grandmother, who had died when he was 16. She had been a strong woman who had raised 7 children during difficult economic times, and her death had been the first real loss that James had experienced. He remembered sitting by her bedside in the small hospital in his hometown, holding her hand as she slipped away peacefully in her sleep. The experience had taught him that death, while always sad, could also be a moment of profound love and connection. But this death would affect far more than just one family. The Queen's passing would trigger constitutional procedures that had been planned for decades, but never implemented. Within hours, Prince Charles would become King Charles III, and a new chapter in British history would begin. The Commonwealth countries would need to acknowledge their new monarch, and governments around the world would issue statements recognizing the end of the Elizabethan age. As the clock approached 10 o'clock, James noticed that the activity in the corridor had become minimal. The doctors remained in the Queen's apartments, and the family members had gathered in the bedroom where the Queen lay dying. The palace staff who had been rushing about earlier had completed their immediate preparations, and now the building seemed to be waiting in respectful silence. James had never experienced anything like the atmosphere that had settled over Buckingham Palace. During his 6 years of service, he had witnessed many significant events, but nothing had compared to the profound sense of history in motion that he felt tonight. The very walls of the palace seemed to acknowledge that they were about to witness the end of an era. The Queen's corgis, her beloved companions for decades, had been quietly brought to a room near her apartments. James could occasionally hear their soft movements, and he suspected they somehow sensed that something important was happening. Animals often had an intuitive understanding of death that humans sometimes lacked, and the corgi's unusual quietness seemed to reflect the solemn mood that had settled over the palace. Margaret emerged from the Queen's apartments once more, this time carrying a small leather portfolio that James recognized as containing important official documents. She walked with purpose toward the palace's administrative offices, and James realized that the final legal and constitutional preparations were being completed. The Queen's death would require immediate action on numerous legal and ceremonial fronts, and every detail had been planned and rehearsed for this moment. The Archbishop appeared in the doorway of the Queen's apartments and gestured to someone inside. James couldn't see who he was addressing, but the gesture seemed to indicate that the final moments were approaching. The Archbishop's presence had brought a sense of spiritual comfort to the proceedings, and James felt grateful that the Queen would not face death alone or without the consolation of her faith. Prince Charles emerged from the Queen's rooms, and walked to the window again, this time staying there for several minutes as he looked out over the palace grounds. James could see that the prince was struggling with the weight of what was about to happen. In a matter of hours, he would transform from heir apparent to monarch, taking on responsibilities that would last for the rest of his life. The palace communications team appeared in the corridor once more, this time with what appeared to be final drafts of the announcements that would soon be released to the world. James recognized several faces from the press office, people who had spent years managing the careful flow of information about the royal family. Tonight, they would be responsible for sharing news that would affect millions of people around the world. Dr. Harrison emerged from the Queen's apartments and spoke quietly with the Archbishop. Their conversation lasted only a few moments, but James could see in their expressions that the end was very near. The doctor's medical expertise and the Archbishop's spiritual guidance were combining to ensure that the Queen's final moments would be as peaceful and dignified as possible. James thought about all the people around the world who had no idea that their Queen was dying at this very moment. In a few hours, television and radio broadcasts would interrupt regular programming to share the news, and millions of people would stop what they were doing to absorb the information. Social media would explode with tributes and memories, and news websites would crash under the weight of traffic as people sought more details about the Queen's death. But, right now, in this quiet corridor of Buckingham Palace, the world's longest reigning monarch was spending her final hours surrounded by the people who loved her most. Her children and grandchildren were at her bedside, her doctors were ensuring her comfort, and her spiritual advisor was providing the consolation of faith. Despite all the protocol and ceremony that would follow her death, these final moments were deeply personal and human. The clock chimed 10:30, and James realized that his shift would normally be ending soon. However, Captain Morrison had indicated that he might be required to remain at his post longer than usual, given the circumstances. James was grateful for this possibility. He wanted to see this historic night through to its conclusion, regardless of how long that might take. Princess and emerged from the Queen's apartments, her composure finally beginning to crack after hours of maintaining royal dignity. She walked to a small alcove in the corridor and sat down heavily in a chair that had been placed there for family members who needed a brief respite from the intensity of the vigil. James could see tears on her face, and he felt a deep sympathy for the princess as she struggled with the loss of her mother. The Queen's personal chaplain arrived at the palace and was quickly escorted to her apartments. James had seen the chaplain many times over the years, and he knew that the man had developed a close personal relationship with the Queen through their regular prayer meetings and spiritual discussions. His presence would provide additional comfort during these final hours. James reflected on the incredible life that the Queen had lived. She had ascended to the throne at just 25 years old, after the unexpected death of her father, King George VI. She had been crowned in 1953 in a ceremony that was broadcast live on television, introducing millions of people around the world to the pageantry and tradition of British monarchy. Over the following 70 years, she had met with 12 different prime ministers, hosted countless world leaders, and guided Britain through decades of social and political change. The Queen had witnessed the end of the British Empire and the emergence of the Commonwealth. She had seen Britain join and leave the European Union. She had lived through the Cold War, the rise of terrorism, and the digital revolution. Through all of these changes, she had remained a constant presence, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining the dignity and stability that people expected from their monarch. Dr. Harrison emerged from the Queen's apartments and made eye contact with James for the first time all day. The doctor's expression was grave, and he walked slowly toward the palace communications office. James suspected that Dr. Harrison was about to inform the press team that the Queen's death was imminent, triggering the final preparations for the public announcement that would soon follow. The Archbishop reappeared in the doorway and gestured toward the interior of the Queen's apartments. James could see movement inside as family members gathered around what he assumed was the Queen's bedside. The moment that the entire Commonwealth had been dreading for years was finally arriving, and James found himself holding his breath as he stood at attention in the corridor. Prince Charles entered the Queen's bedroom, followed by Princess and Prince Andrew, and Prince Edward. Prince William and Prince Harry joined them, along with other family members who had arrived throughout the day. The Queen's closest confidants and staff members were also present, creating a circle of love and support around the dying monarch. James thought about the millions of people who considered the Queen to be their grandmother figure, even though they had never met her personally. She had been a constant presence in their lives, appearing on their currency, their postage stamps, and their television screens. Her Christmas broadcasts had become annual traditions for families across the Commonwealth, and her public appearances had marked significant occasions in the lives of ordinary citizens. The silence in the corridor became complete as the final moments approached. Even the usual sounds of the palace, the distant hum of air conditioning, the occasional footstep in other parts of the building, the faint traffic noise from the street outside, seemed to fade away. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for the moment that would mark the end of the longest reign in British history. James straightened his shoulders and prepared himself to witness history. He knew that for the rest of his life, he would remember this night and his role as a silent guardian during the Queen's final hours. The young man from Yorkshire who had never imagined meeting royalty was about to become a witness to one of the most significant moments in modern history. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as James Mitchell adjusted his black uniform for what he believed would be another ordinary day. At 28 years old, James had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, standing motionless for hours in his iconic red tunic and bearskin hat outside the palace gates. But today was different. Today he had been selected for special indoor duty, a rare honor that came with both privilege and tremendous responsibility. James had grown up in a small town in Yorkshire, where his father worked in a coal mine and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. The royal family seemed like distant figures from fairy tales, people who existed in newspapers and television broadcasts, but never in real life. When James decided to join the military at 18, becoming a Queen's Guard was the furthest thing from his mind. He simply wanted steady work and the chance to serve his country. The path to becoming a Queen's Guard was not easy. After completing basic military training, James spent 2 years with his regiment before being selected for the elite ceremonial duties. The training was intense and demanding. Guards had to master the art of standing perfectly still for hours, regardless of weather conditions, crowds, or distractions. They learned to ignore tourists who tried to make them laugh, protesters who shouted at them, and even birds that sometimes landed on their tall black hats. James remembered his first day on duty outside the palace gates. His legs had cramped after just 30 minutes, and sweat had poured down his face inside the heavy bearskin hat. A group of American tourists had spent 20 minutes trying to make him smile, taking photos and telling jokes. One woman had even waved a 50-pound note in front of his face, promising to give it to him if he would just wink. James had remained statue still, but inside he was fighting every instinct to move. Over the years, James had witnessed countless moments of history from his post. He had stood guard during state visits from world leaders, watched as dignitaries arrived for important meetings, and observed the daily rhythm of palace life. He had seen the Queen herself dozens of times, always impressed by her composure and dignity even in her advanced age. She was 96 years old now, and while she still maintained her royal duties, everyone could see that her strength was fading. The assignment that morning came from Captain Morrison, a stern man in his 50s who had served in the Guards for over 20 years. Captain Morrison rarely showed emotion, but James noticed something different in his expression as he delivered the briefing. "Mitchell, you've been selected for indoor duty today," Captain Morrison said, his voice more gentle than usual. "You'll be stationed outside the Queen's private apartments. This is highly sensitive duty, and I trust you understand the significance." James nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what made this assignment different from his usual outdoor posts. Indoor duty was considered an honor, but it was also known to be incredibly quiet and sometimes boring. Guards stationed inside the palace often spent entire shifts without seeing another person, standing in empty corridors for hours at a time. "The Queen has been feeling unwell lately," Captain Morrison continued, lowering his voice. "The doctors are with her regularly, and there may be visitors today." Family members, you are to maintain your post regardless of what you see or hear. Is that understood? Yes, sir, James replied, though something in the captain's tone made him feel uneasy. There was an weight to his words that suggested this was more than a routine assignment. James made his way through the palace corridors, marveling as always at the incredible artwork and furnishings that surrounded him. Massive oil paintings depicted centuries of British history, crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceilings, and every surface seemed to gleam with polish and care. Despite working at the palace for 6 years, James still felt like an ordinary person who had somehow wandered into a museum. The corridor where he would stand guard was located on the 2nd floor, outside a set of double doors that led to the Queen's private sitting room. It was a relatively quiet area of the palace, away from the bustle of official business and tourist areas. James had been stationed here a few times before, and he remembered it as peaceful duty where the biggest challenge was staying alert during long stretches of silence. As James took his position, he noticed that the atmosphere felt different today. There was a hushed quality to the palace that he hadn't experienced before. Staff members who passed by walked more quietly than usual, speaking in whispers when they communicated at all. The usual sounds of palace life, the clicking of heels on marble floors, the distant ringing of telephones, the murmur of conversations, seemed muted. Dr. Harrison, the Queen's personal physician, arrived shortly after James had taken his post. The elderly doctor nodded politely to James as he entered the Queen's apartments, his medical bag in hand, and his expression serious. James had seen Dr. Harrison many times over the years, but today the doctor looked particularly grave. Over the next hour, other doctors arrived. James recognized some of them from previous visits, but others were new faces who carried themselves with the authority of specialists. They entered and exited the Queen's apartments in a steady stream, their conversations too quiet for James to overhear, but their body language speaking volumes about the seriousness of the situation. Prince Charles arrived at midday, his face showing the strain of worry and exhaustion. Behind him came Princess and Prince Andrew and Prince Edward. James had seen the royal family members many times during his service, but never all together like this, and never looking so concerned. They greeted James with small nods before disappearing behind the closed doors. As the afternoon wore on, more family members arrived. Prince William and Prince Harry came together, their usual easy manner replaced by obvious anxiety. Catherine, the Duchess of Cambridge, arrived with them, her typically perfect composure showing cracks of genuine emotion. Even the Queen's great-grandchildren were brought to the palace, though they were quickly whisked away to other parts of the building. James maintained his rigid posture throughout all of this, but his mind was racing. The assembly of so many family members, the constant presence of doctors, and the somber mood that had settled over the palace could only mean one thing. The Queen, the woman who had reigned over Britain for 70 years, was dying. The realization hit James with unexpected force. Despite being surrounded by royalty and history every day, he had somehow never considered that this moment would come. The Queen had always seemed eternal, a constant presence that would continue forever. The idea that her reign might be ending felt impossible to accept. As evening approached, Archbishop Welby arrived at the palace. The presence of the Archbishop of Canterbury confirmed James's fears about the gravity of the situation. Religious leaders were typically called to the palace only for the most significant occasions, and their arrival often meant that final rites might be necessary. The corridor outside the Queen's apartments had become increasingly busy throughout the day, but now a different kind of quiet settled over the area. Family members spoke in hushed tones when they emerged from the Queen's rooms, and several times James observed tears in their eyes. The doctors continued their work, but their movements had become more careful and deliberate. James thought about his own family back in Yorkshire. His parents had lived their entire adult lives under Queen Elizabeth's reign. She had been on the throne when his father started working in the mines, when his parents got married, when James himself was born. For 3 generations of his family, the Queen had been the one constant in an ever-changing world. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, James noticed a change in the activity level. The steady stream of doctors and family members slowed, and Those who remained in the Queen's apartment stayed longer between their brief appearances in the corridor. The Archbishop had been inside for over an hour, and the silence from behind the closed doors felt heavy with significance. James had been standing guard for nearly 10 hours, but his training had prepared him for much longer shifts. However, the emotional weight of the day was unlike anything he had experienced in his military service. This wasn't about physical endurance or mental discipline. This was about witnessing history as it unfolded, being present for a moment that would be remembered forever. A member of the Queen's personal staff, a woman named Margaret whom James had seen countless times over the years, emerged from the apartments with tears streaming down her face. She paused for a moment when she saw James, and their eyes met briefly. In that instant, James saw in her expression the confirmation of what he had suspected all day. The Queen's condition had worsened significantly. Margaret composed herself quickly and continued down the corridor, but her brief moment of visible emotion spoke volumes about what was happening behind those closed doors. James had never seen any member of the Queen's staff show such open emotion while on duty. The palace staff were trained to maintain professionalism at all times, just as the guards were trained to remain motionless regardless of circumstances. As the evening deepened, James found himself thinking about all the moments he had witnessed during his 6 years of service. He remembered state dinners where world leaders gathered in glittering ballrooms, their conversations shaping international policy. He had stood guard during garden parties where thousands of citizens met the Queen personally, each interaction brief, but meaningful to those involved. He thought about the children who visited the palace on school trips, their faces filled with wonder as they glimpsed the world of royalty. He remembered foreign dignitaries who arrived with great ceremony, their visits marking important diplomatic relationships. All of these moments had taken place under the reign of Queen Elizabeth II, and now that era was coming to an end. The weight of history seemed to press down on the corridor where James stood. In this very building, decisions had been made that affected millions of people around the world. Treaties had been signed, wars had been declared and ended, and social changes had been embraced or resisted. Through all of it, the Queen had been the steady center around which everything else revolved. James realized that he was witnessing the end of the longest reign in British history. When Queen Elizabeth took the throne in 1952, Britain was still rebuilding from World War II. The empire was vast, but beginning to transform into the Commonwealth. Television was a new technology, and few people owned sets. Now, in 2022, the world had changed beyond recognition, but the Queen had remained a constant presence through decades of transformation. As the clock approached 9 in the evening, James noticed that the family members were staying inside the Queen's apartments for longer periods. The brief exits to the corridor became less frequent, suggesting that they were gathering for what might be the final moments of the Queen's life. The doctors, too, seemed to have settled in for an extended vigil rather than making their usual quick examinations. The silence in the corridor became almost complete. Even the usual sounds of the palace seemed to fade away, as if the entire building was holding its breath. James maintained his military bearing, but inside he felt the profound significance of the moment. He was about to become a witness to history, standing guard during the final hours of a reign that had lasted longer than most people's entire lifetimes. Dr. Harrison emerged from the Queen's apartments one final time, his expression grave as he spoke quietly with a member of the palace staff. James couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see in their body language that the situation had reached a critical point. The doctor's movements were slow and deliberate, and when he returned to the Queen's rooms, he closed the doors with unusual care. James thought about the millions of people around the world who would soon learn that their Queen was dying. In Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and a dozen other Commonwealth countries, people would gather around televisions and radios to follow the news. In Britain itself, the nation would begin a period of mourning unlike anything seen in living memory. But, for now, in this quiet corridor of Buckingham Palace, the only witnesses to history were the royal family, the medical staff, and one young guard from Yorkshire who had never imagined that his routine duty assignment would place him at the center of such a momentous event. James straightened his shoulders and prepared to maintain his post for however long the night might last. knowing that he was about to witness the end of an era that had defined the lives of generations.